Welcome back to the 905er, Cameron Kroetsch, this time Ward 2 Councillor for the fine city of Hamilton. Thank you, Councillor Kroetsch, for coming on to talk about this very important topic today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Good to see you both.
So, if you live in Hamilton, you no doubt know about this story, but if you could just please summarize for those of our listeners who live outside of Hamilton, what has happened between you and the Hamilton Police Service Board in the last month?
Yeah, in the last month, it's been quite a bit. I mean, if we extend that to maybe 45 days, I could say a bit more, but I think that they filed a complaint with the Ontario Civilian Police Commission, and that complaint alleges that I shouldn't have been putting motions forward at City Council to ensure that the budget process was happening in a more transparent way. And I shouldn't have made comments to social media and comments on mainstream media about the budget process. Of course, I've also been involved in bringing forward motions. Myself and fellow board member Angeli Menezes and I brought forward 4 motions on February 13th to the police board to ask for some changes to the budget and oversight and a reduction of nearly about $5 million to the police budget. That's also been a big part of the conversation. So
this is also
those are the 2 things that have been going on most, I think.
I think this is also happening under the shadow of Hamilton City Council trying to present a budget, an overall budget to the city, and you were trying, and this was, I believe, an attempt to try and just rein in spending to prevent any unnecessary tax increases to fund things. And this is, do I have that correct? Is that a correct belief?
Yeah, it is correct. What happens is that the city's budgeting process is a massive thing, right? Billions of dollars in Hamilton. The police budget is a subsection of that and the largest part of the city's budget, but it's all tangled together, right? So as the city is approving its budget, it's considering a submission from the board. And I really want to say this because I think that maybe not everyone is as boring as I am. They don't read the Police Services Act on a daily basis. I have kind of parts of it committed to memory. And so it's really important to say that the police service themselves, as in the chief of police and other folks who do financial things, they put forward a budget through a budget committee at the police service in Hamilton. And the board itself is the one that comes up with what they call an estimate. That's what they call their budget in the law, an estimate. And they send that estimate over to the city. Ultimately, it's a city who determines the police services budget. So I'm in 2 positions. I'm at one time at the police board having a conversation about what we're going to send to the city council. And I'm over there at city council also receiving it, catching the ball and then saying things there. I have to be a bit careful in terms of making sure that the comments I make at the police services board and the comments I make at city council are the same, that I'm not contradicting myself. Because that would be undermining my integrity, undermining the board's integrity. But I'm certainly within my rights to, as long as I make sure people know it's me speaking and not on behalf of the board, make comments that are dissent, from the norm. But yeah.
We should have mentioned before we started, Cameron, and I'll just say it now, and we can edit it out. If you see me waving a finger, that's not aimed at you. That's for me aimed at Joel. It's us trying not to talk over each other. So you carry on speaking as long as you want. But I just wanted to jump in on that point. There's this idea. I mean, and I noted the last time we spoke to you actually was back when you were facing a similar kind of disciplinary situation in many ways, because you'd spoken publicly about publicly accessible documents at City Hall at that point. And it's kind of like this is history repeating itself in some way. Is there anything in law that says that a person, by sitting on a committee, particularly an elected person who has the votes of the public behind them, loses the ability to have an opinion and to state that opinion publicly because they sit on a committee? I mean, obviously there are rules of confidentiality sometimes, but this isn't, they're not claiming you've broken confidentiality as far as I'm aware. It's simply that you're speaking against the objectives of the board, as I understand it, and then that having and I know this is something that well, we'll come back to this in a subsequent question, but maybe just to sort of address yourself to that part first, that that there's a kind of implication here that you kind of lose your ability to speak or comment having been on the police board to start with.
Yeah, it's a really important point. I think it's something that's worth a few seconds of unpacking. So no, I'm not prevented from saying basically whatever I want, as long as it's not in violation of, I think, the basic norms of boards. I can't be saying things that are defamatory. I can't be accusing people of things that aren't true. All the things I think that we know you can't say. But I'm allowed to make an opinion based on facts. So I can look at something, I can say I don't agree with people, I can present contrary information, I can do all that kind of stuff. I can be critical. I can even be negative if I want to be. I have to make sure, though, that I'm doing that within the context of the meeting itself, that I'm not doing that in any kind of way that would be considered, considered to be attacking someone in a way the law would care about. And we don't have to talk about what the law cares about, but those are specific things, and we get some training in general as counselors about this. And generally speaking, have a good sense. I've been on dozens of boards in my life and understand how these things work. But what happens is that generally speaking, boards and councils and everything work in a majority principle. The majority of that board, of our council or police board or whatever it might be, works in a majority principle that says if the majority doesn't like something, they just don't have to permit it, right? They can find a way not to permit that from happening. And every board of this level has a complaint process or something like that. And so if the majority of the board says, look, we decide that this person is doing something we don't like, they can complain about it to a higher body, and the higher body can then weigh in on that. And as we know from all different kinds of bodies that weigh in on things, sometimes they weigh in on things in a way that's judicially fair, and sometimes they weigh in things that are not judicially fair. And that's what judicial review processes are for, to talk about whether or not judicially fair decisions are being made. So right now it's for the OCPC to decide what they're going to do with this. We have had our time to, submit documents to them as part of the investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Can't talk really about the investigation in any detail because that piece is a bit confidential, but the next kind of steps in that are really something I could talk about later if you want to know more. But yeah, there's nothing stopping me from being able to say these things. And again, I made sure to ask our lawyer at the board about this specific point, because as someone who's been held to, I think, an unfair level of scrutiny for the comments they make, I'm very mindful that when I make those comments, I'm going to be, again, held to an unfair level of scrutiny, because it makes people uncomfortable in a polite society, to put it that way, for me to sometimes ask a direct question. And really, when you're in the context of a police board, this has to be said, it's an uber authoritarian structure. What I mean is, it's called a police force for a reason, right? So there's a lot of authority inside of a police force. Well, the authority above the authority is the police board, right? So if you look at all the different kinds of things that go on in cities, the police board is probably the most authoritarian kind of place. I don't mean that they're acting in an authoritarian way. I mean, there's a lot of power and authority at a police board. And when you're there asking questions of a police chief, right, that's not something that I've noticed anyways in my observations. It happens regularly. But I'm the kind of person that asks questions at every meeting I'm at, and I've been at since I've ever been on boards. And so that creates a certain kind of tension that people aren't used to. It creates a countercultural, a new norm when someone like me is on a police board, and it creates a bit of tension. And so that's just part of what's going on here, truthfully.
I just want to kind of touch on that point and kind of get to the crux of what's going on here. Is that I think to our listeners, and the vast majority of people would understand, okay, the police service is a massive expenditure on any municipality's payroll. Or a budget, I should say. That should come with oversight. That's what a council is elected for, is to oversee the finances of the city first and foremost. And so asking questions like, are we getting the best tax dollar use out of what we're spending here? Do you need an increase? And I understand the police board was asking for an increase this time out, as they often do.
I think always would be the
well, okay, I was trying to be polite here.
Well, I mean, if anybody can email in if there's ever been a
Yeah.
day when occasion when police service. I mean, yeah. Anyway,
But my point being was that are we just becoming deferential to this fetishization of our police? You know, like to push back to the police, say you don't need extra funding. You can get by with what you got last year. We were just safe and sound last year. There's not really a need to give an increase. And I guess that's it. It's just that, is there a culture that of just police saying, we want more, you're going to give us more, because if you don't give us more, we're going to say, well, crime's increasing, and this is because Cameron Kroetsch said no to more money. When anyone to know, crime is a myriad of different sources and reasons and whatnot. Are we just fetishizing police to the point where we can't say no to them?
You know, people certainly say Cameron Kroetsch is advocating for a reduction in the police budget, and so therefore, as a result, he's responsible for what happens with policing, which I think, of course, is being said by some people. It's completely untrue. It's not founded. It's not how policing works. And the police are the ones who decide how they operationally use their force. To your overall question about this, I think there's three really important things to think about. Right around amalgamation, we went from having the Hamilton Wentworth Regional Police Services Board. Amalgamation, that went away. We became the Hamilton Police Services Board. And from that time till about now, we've seen originally around 80% of all costs were human resources related, and now we're closer to 90. So one of the things you see happening every year is the costs for human resources are going up as a percentage of the budget, which creates a pressure, right? So only 10% are capital costs. So that in itself is something that needs to be talked about more in terms of what we see for the reasons why police are asking for more money. There are some legitimate reasons why. Year over year, inflation, I think we all understand, is a thing that happens every year that asks for requests. Legally, the city's mandated by law to provide actually some direct money for capital costs for policing things. That includes things like buildings where the police are situated, cars, other kinds of things, right? So there is always a context for them to be asking for additional funds to do certain things every year. But I think the real issue here is that people make the police budget, you know, linked directly to supporting police, right? And that's the issue here. I got that vibe from many of my colleagues who I think were saying, look, I support this police, so I'm going to be voting in favor of this. Meanwhile, I think they also support the Public Works Department. They support the Planning Department. I think my colleagues, by and large, support those folks doing the emergency and community services work in our, fire, paramedics, you name it, housing and homelessness. But they apply a scrutiny to those departments they don't apply to policing. It's because I think culturally, it's become, at least politically, I'll say, something that people have avoided. There's a long history in Ontario about that, about politicians who've spoken out against the police and what's happened in those situations. You've seen this happen this year in Toronto, where Mayor Olivia Chow was coming out saying, look, we're going to take a very, very tiny amount off the police budget here, and had a huge campaign waged against her for trying to do so by the police associations and other folks in that circle. So there's a thing going on here that I think is overlapping all of this. And I tried to say several times, this is not a question or a conversation about supporting police or not supporting police. This is really a fiscal conversation. And I tried very hard to draw comparisons between council's actual budget and the police's budget, where there were obvious comparisons, to make this really easy for everyone. So for instance, this year in the city's budget, we said, look, we're kind of in a financial pickle. So we're going to use our reserves to offset some of the costs that we're passing on to taxpayers. Here's our reserve strategy. We're going to take approximately 59, I forget how much exactly it was, around 60% of the reserves, I think, that are discretionary this year to apply. I think it was $152 million that we're going to use. I said to the police, great, here's your reserve amount. Let's take the same percentages, create the same reserve strategy, and we'll use that to take the amount of money being asked from taxpayers for the police budget down. And there wasn't even a discussion about it, it was just voted down as no. So you have this, and it's weird because you have the same folks on the city side, right, who were, as other members of city council, like the mayor, who were voting in favor of having this reserve strategy. In fact, it came as a mandate she put forward, but then over at the police board was saying no to the very same thing. So it's because I think, again, there's this notionality around police budgeting, meaning police support, and this sense that giving more money to police means more police officers. Meanwhile, the chief of police said this year, this isn't about more officers this year. Regardless, that mythology persists, and that's something that's pushed politically to make it seem like every single dollar that relates to policing relates to community safety. And we know that's just not true. We know that, for many reasons.
Well, I was just going to, I just want to follow up with that, because any other budget, not just municipal, but provincial, federal, when you look at how taxes are spent, there's a question of effectiveness that's always brought up, right? We always say, oh, we're spending so much money on X program. Is it effective? Are we just putting money into a wasteful program? And we have no problem. Let's take snow removal at the municipal level, right? If the snow removal budget line isn't used fully, it's reevaluated for the next year, because that's just how it goes. And the question, why wouldn't we put that towards the largest line item for any municipality to say, well, are we seeing crime decrease? Because clearly, like, if you weren't able to do it keep crime at a moderate level this year, why are we going to assume putting more money into it next year is going to solve the problem, right? Or if you say, well, no, crime has kind of plateaued. Okay, well, clearly you can do the job effectively given this amount of money. See if we can just keep the trend going. And I'm just wondering, like, everyone's saying, oh, we need the mighty taxpayer needs to be served, and there's an argument to be made there. But for some reason, we just don't hold this logic to the biggest expenditure that any municipality would have. What's the logic behind that?
Well, I think what you're seeing right now happening with me is the answer. Why don't we have these conversations? This is why. Because when we have conversations about policing, when we have conversations about reducing police budgets, when we have practical, sensible motions brought forward, and that's what I brought forward, were some really practical motions that, in short, it was, don't try and have reductions in the police budget this way. That's not the way to do it, right? Don't do it this way. That's not the way to do it. If you want to do it through the budget process, do it through the board. Great. I'll sign up to join this board. I'm going to be here. We'll have these conversations. I'll do it the right. Oh, still not okay to have this conversation? Okay. So that's a big piece of what's happening here, is that it seems to be that trying to have those conversations about these budgets is not allowed. And when you do it, and when you push those conversations, and when you talk about what happens transparently, people react by complaining about you. And that complaint process takes up a lot of time. And honestly, it discourages people from wanting to participate in these conversations.
This is something that I've been aware of for some time. And I'll quote you, this is a comment, and I'm paraphrasing because I didn't write it down at the time, but it sticks very clearly in my memory. And it's from a member of another council, not Hamilton, different police board, but a councillor who, when I spoke to them about this exact process, said, yeah, in theory, we have the ability to vote down or to not approve the police budget. In reality, we don't have that power. If we ever do that, all hell will break loose. Is this all hell breaking loose? Or is this just kind of a shot across the bows, do you think? But I mean, I think that comment illustrates exactly what you're talking about, that a very senior figure on a council, experienced, not like first time elected or anything like that, would basically say, we don't really have the power to control police budgets. That's just like a rubber stamp situation. They give us the budget, we approve it.
That's a really important social question. It's a very important political question. The law is really clear. Council has absolutely all the authority in the situation. In fact, the law hasn't really even been tested on this in any kind of rigorous way, because there have been so few instances that councils have said no to police boards, but there isn't really a volume of law to give us a good sense of what the precedent would be if someone actually did this and tried to do it. and said no. The way it works really simply is we receive an estimate from the police. We can negotiate with the police around that estimate like we can with anybody else. And that's what I tried to do by saying, look, the city said we're going to put a 4% cap on the municipal tax bit. Can you all do the same? And that was the genesis of a motion that passed 12-3, actually. So overwhelming majority of councillors supported that, went back to the police board. But when the police said, no, we're not going to change this entire budget by 1 single cent, not a cent, despite the fact that we have all these motions being brought forward and all kinds of practical solutions about how we could reduce our costs, we're not doing it, not a cent. Okay, I came back to council and it was passed. And that is the question for council. I think a lot of times it's because there's a fear about, well, what's going to happen if we say no? And it's quite simple. We can say no. We provide an answer as to what we are going to let the estimate be. And we have a range of options in there, right? You could say, we're not going to give you an increase for this year, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do this, or we're going to do this. We could have a blanket amount. For instance, we say, we're going to reduce the budget by this blanket amount like Olivia Chow did, all manner of things. The choice that happens if we ever pass that is they can appeal that decision. That decision gets appealed, and there's an appeals process, right?
Well,
and why we'd be so afraid of an appeals process is beyond me. I think it's got nothing to do with the fear of an appeals process, right? The city gets taken to court all the time. So
I just want to say, like, this whole appeal process, and I'm hoping our listeners are finding the parallels here between what's happening here and, say, the planning process, is that if somebody doesn't like what a city council decides, we appeal it to a higher body.
The Ontario Land Tribunal, yeah.
Yes. And that's what's happening here, is that, okay, clearly the board is like, no, we wanted our budget passed. Council and you as a member of that council says, no, we need to put this peg into the hole somehow. We got to find a way to trim some budgets there. Can you work with us? And somebody said, no, I don't have to listen to the council. I just go to this other body. And so no, like, nothing's been done. Like, we're waiting on this appeal from the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. You're silenced. You can't sit on the board and exercise your powers as a councillor for Hamilton on the board. You're effectively neutered out of that position, and we're still waiting on a budget from the board because nothing's been moved ahead. Like, my question, I guess, is just how much power exactly does the city council have over its own budgetary process?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, to be fair, council in the end decided to approve the police budget, so everything's moved ahead with the budget, and that's done and over with, right? In the end, that was the decision that they made when it came back, and the police said we don't want to move on this. Council just caved, and I voted against that, obviously. So, I'm now in a situation where the complaint has meant that I'm asked to relieve myself of my duties on the police board. So until the complaint has been finished being investigated and they decide if they're going to have a hearing or whatever, then that's where I'm at now, just to be super clear about that. But in terms of what control councils have over budgets, it's a great question. We see so much control at city council about its budget. I mean it. We get presented with many hundreds of pages of documents. And we have individual councillors coming along saying, I want to look at that line item, that line, that line, that line. We're having a line by line discussion practically at our budget meetings over a series of months, and then we come to a decision. And so while staff prepare all that, and we're not necessarily involved in the preparation, we're involved in the scrutiny, the discussion, all that kind of stuff. And one of the things I've been very public and commenting about is that kind of process doesn't happen at the police board. And that's one of the reasons that the complaint was filed against me, is because I keep saying that out loud, that we're not having that rigorous kind of process at the police board. And we have to have that rigorous process at a police board, especially when it's the largest part of the city's municipal budget. Changes to the police budget have a correlative impact on the city's budget. If you're able to substantially reduce a police budget, you can substantially reduce the city's budget because it's the largest portion of that budget when it comes to the net tax levy. So those are the kinds of things that I think it's important to get out there, is that there's an incredible amount of control in, say, the councils have. And anyone out there saying that a city council can't do that has never read the Police Services Act, has never really dug into this. And frankly, I think in some cases, especially for those who've been around long enough to know, is being a bit disingenuous in terms of saying, well, we can't do anything here. But I think what happened this year, and I want to say this, we didn't hear that this year. We turned a huge corner at City Council. Well, we understood our role very clearly. And I was, I'll say, a bit painfully clear about it, because I didn't want to leave that council chamber with any single person in that room saying, we can't do anything about this, and this is about supporting police. And so I kept coming back on the microphone saying, that's not what's happening here. This is what the law says. It's within our jurisdiction. And so the vote that we had this year was conclusive and clear around, I think, more of a political question. And people still said in the end, their comments, things like, well, I support the police, so I'm supporting the budget. So that's the discussion. That's where we're at. But we're seeing a growing number in Hamilton of councillors who are voting against it. In year one, that was 5. Now there's 6. And I'm hoping as time comes on, we get more and more people coming on side saying, you know what, I'm concerned about this. I'm concerned about us every year just saying absolutely yes. Coming back to them, we ask every other department for reductions. We put pressure on every other member of city staff, the fire department, the paramedics, everybody else to reduce their budget. And we're not doing the same thing with police when they bring their budgets forward. And we need to be doing that. Has to happen in a more transparent and accountable way. And that's all I've been asking for and all I've been saying all along. I haven't been saying anything else. And I've been speaking on these things really factually and truthfully. And to still have a complaint filed in the face of that, I think says it all.
I mean, yeah, and it really speaks, to our listeners. I mean, it's why I have always found provincial politics and then municipal politics much more interesting than federal politics, because it's like, this is where the real stuff happens at municipal level, stuff that affects us every day, and why the public should pay so much more attention to this. Because if you're talking about, obviously this whole thing has the background subtext of the kind of defund the police movement and Black Lives Matter movement, all those things, which I suspect is playing in the minds of a whole bunch of people with like, well, here's Cameron Kroetsch, who's like kind of known to be on the left of the political spectrum, and he's out to get the police or whatever. That may not be what's going on, but that would be the kind of thing that plays in people's minds. And really what we're talking about here is just normal, legitimate democratic oversight that is right there in the law. And nothing is going to happen unless council votes for it, and council has the will of the people quite literally behind it. So what's the problem? I find it's very frustrating. I wanted to move on to a slightly different point, which is this reminds me of something that happened again in another council. And it wasn't to do with the police board, but it was a councillor who, after a vote had been taken, so a decision had been made, criticized the decision of the council and said, basically, I don't agree. I voted against it. I don't agree. I think it was a bad decision, and was then disciplined for having kind of openly disagreed with their own council. That there's this strange thing that you're elected to have an opinion and to cast a vote in council for whatever issue, and then after that has been taken, you have to support the council regardless. However much you loathe the decision, you are meant to support it. Now, perhaps that was specific to a particular municipality. I suspect it's generally the kind of way that things are seen, because we don't have a party system, that after the decision you're meant to support it. But it's this kind of strange, archaic idea that you kind of lose your opinion to have your ability to have an opinion at various points when you're on particular committees or when you're in a particular context within municipal government. Do you find that strange, difficult? Have you run into that issue at all yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what started the complaint in 2019, 2020. The Integrity Commissioner complaint was about me doing something that was dissenting. It wasn't that it was illegal, or it wasn't that it was I'd revealed something that I shouldn't have. It was that it was dissenting. What I'm doing now is I'm dissenting. And there's a couple interesting principles about this, and I want to then come back to this point about municipal government, because I think that's important. Look, Supreme Courts around the world are set up in a way where when they make a decision, right, there's allowed to be dissenting viewpoints, and they find a way to express that. And I would say many governments around the world, and Canada and Ontario at the municipal level, have healthy democratic regulations to allow for dissent. a lot of that comes from the debate process itself, right? So at the table, you're allowed to say a bunch of things. Social media has changed that a bit, because for a really, really long time, and I want to say that, a really, really long time, all we had until 2019, I would say, in Hamilton specifically, maybe 2018 to be fair, but is we were relying on, number one, folks who were having to catch the live stream, maybe on a cable network, cable 14, the newspaper, some other means, but very few other means to be able to actually engage with and hear debates. But there's always two kinds of discourses. One was at the table, and then two was afterwards in the media. If they would ask you questions or you'd have an interview, then you might be able to express your opinion again or something like that. Now that we have social media and other ways on the internet to express ourselves, there's become a variety of nuances around this. And I think the law and democratic institutions and many folks in politics haven't caught up and don't appreciate or realize that these media that are newer can sometimes have a lot more capital with different groups of people who have not necessarily traditionally been involved in municipal politics, who frankly, to say it in a way I think we all understand, have been marginalized. So now that those groups are being able to come in and the conversations and discourse are happening in ways that people can't regulate, they're reacting to that. And we're seeing a huge backlash to that. Before, you could control the narrative quite tightly because it was just a few channels of getting that information out. A soundbite meant a lot more than it did now. And that kind of pithy back and forth debate on really broad brush stroke points was all there was available to people. Now we can have nuanced, detailed discussions, provide facts, images, videos, charts, spreadsheets, reports. We can do things ourselves. We don't rely on others to do them for us. We're not relying on the institution to do them for us. We're not relying on the media to do them for us. I can do it myself now. And that's been the big change and the big thing that I think it's happening. I think also what you're seeing happening too, to get to your earlier question about maybe why you think the municipal government is more interesting than what I do, it's harder to hide now. You can hide inside of a larger bureaucracy or parliament because it goes through a bunch of extra officious activities that a municipal council, if it did, would be considered absurd. You don't prorogue a municipal council, but you sure can do it to parliament. You sure can take a long vacation at parliament. You can do all these kinds of things that are so obscenely formal that they absolutely obliterate transparency. Whereas at the local level, it's often just 16 people sitting around chatting about some stuff, right? Like it's people talking about an issue, going back and forth about something really hyper local. And now, because of, frankly, the actions of journalists and activists in the community, we're getting this stuff in HD. And we're being able to see it live when it's happening on YouTube. And that level of access, I think, is, again, important and changing. And why it makes municipal politics so interesting to people, because it's a lot harder to hide behind. There's not so much official shenanigans at the front.
And again, I mean, I'm deliberately slightly moving away from the key reason we're speaking to you about here, but I can't resist asking this question because it's something I've asked a number of first sort of term councillors. And I know you are already very familiar with City Hall and probably more familiar than most councillors when you were elected with how it actually worked. But is there anything about the way that City Hall works that and your kind of the constraints on you as a councillor? For instance, the thing that shocked me when I ran for council was learning that you can't even kind of get together with councillors outside the chamber very easily. I mean, you can, but there are limits on how many of you can get together and how you, because that counts as kind of like private, secret conversations. So, you know, there are all kinds of constraints that that don't apply, say, to MPPs or MPs that do apply to councillors and how you're allowed to behave. So I was just wondering, is there anything that kind of like, you know, the day you got the job, were like, oh, wow, I didn't realize that was going to be a thing. And are those things that you think should change?
Yeah, I think I had a pretty healthy education before I got here.
Yeah.
Being the chair of the LGBTQ advisory committee really gave me an insight into things I hadn't even seen before. And plus I was somebody who had always gone to city hall meetings and watched carefully and knew what was up, read the documents, and did all the boring stuff, looking at
Unlike
the
me, you read
procedures.
the documents.
You know? Yeah, I care about this stuff.
I read some of them, I promise.
You know, I think it's important to read them and to the best that you can, but I think to double back a little bit on two of your earlier questions and then answer this one. Yes, there's a community of dislike that happens when you shine a light on how something operates.
Yep.
So I think that's the big thing, is I really do believe in transparency. And one of the first things I did when I got there was kind of started talking to people. Well, what's the process of getting elected look like? What documents do I have to sign? What weird ceremonial things do I have to do? And then showed people too also like, hey, here's all this shredded paper that I came to get at my office when I arrived here. And this is one of the things that a little bit surprised me, was that all the documents that had my predecessor had just been destroyed, and I was meant to come in on a clean slate. And so some of those kinds of, I think, those kinds of what I consider to be absurdities, because there's ways to prevent that from happening in the law, and there's ways to make sure of it. Those kinds of absurdities were interesting. Also, things like my email isn't my own, in a way where when it's FOI'd, I always knew this, but I thought that I also had the ability, for instance, to do something like if there were emails that came in that I thought the public should see, that I could just kind of release those emails and let the public in on that. I was really surprised to learn actually I can't do that. And then because I'd been the only councillor, apparently, according to staff, that had ever asked to do that, then they had to start to think about, what does the process look like for that? So we're still actually, frankly, trying to work that out in a finer way. So a lot of the things I tried to do to make things more accessible, building permit applications, like the list is quite long, actually, of things I've tried to have conversations with city staff about making more accessible. I immediately ran to a barrier of being like, well, this is a corporate document, right? This is owned by the corporation. You know, the piece of this is owned by the corporation, so you can't really. And then to learn, oh, okay, as a councillor, I'm both a member of this organization, not an employee, and also outside this organization as a political person. So then what do I have to do to protect myself? And what do I have to do in terms of my own privacy? And what rights do I have to do all kinds of things in terms of organizing meetings and collecting data? So that whole thing was a bit of a surprise to me, and honestly has constrained my ability to do some work. I've had to kind of just say, all right, if I can't do it with you, I'll do it without you, and just kind of proceed on some things on my own.
And
It's
it
one
really
thing we did
comes
last
back,
year. Yeah.
really comes back to that, the broader point of the kind of institutional, there's an institutional tendency towards secrecy, because for decades that was just the way it was. That we didn't, like you said, the newspaper and the very few methods by which information got out were very closely controlled, and nobody was paying much attention anyway. And so when someone comes along, and I can think that there's you and there's a number of other people I can think of who have sort of tried to shine a light on various things, there's almost an immediate institutional resistance to that. Anyway, both times that, if I can use the phrase, you've been in trouble, so to speak, it's been tied up with that, with the issue of simply saying, here's a document, look at it, read it for yourself. And people objecting to that, even when the documents are already out there in the public domain, that you would make them more public somehow by sharing them.
Right. Extra public.
Yeah, I mean, which is a ludicrous argument to make. Do you think? I mean, do you think that, speaking for Hamilton for a second rather than the police, where I think we're really very much at the start of the process, at a council level, at a municipal level, do you think there's progress being made towards less to the kind of resistance you ran into before you were elected, maybe breaking down, and people and the institution being more open?
Yes, I do actually. I very closely observed the last term of council. I can't speak too much to the terms before that, but the last term of council I really watched carefully, and I found that there were far more members of council who were willing to interject in these issues and kind of stop things from happening and prevent people from speaking, and trying really hard to control this. And I found that in this term of council, that's not been as much the case. I have found the institution actually quite responsive to trying to meet the challenge, because one of the things I think that is perhaps not really talked about and a lot are two things. One, councillors are really the public conduit for city communications, whether we like it or not. Meaning that the city can communicate its corporate communications and press releases and media releases all the time. And certainly the media will call the city's corporate folks, the city manager and the mayor, and ask questions. but they're also going to always reach out to the local councillors or the mayor again and ask politicians for answers to questions. And so it's so important that we're able to actually collaborate around issues and messaging and ideas and about timing, all these kinds of things. And the institution's not used to that at all, it seems, right? It's got its own corporate communications thing it's doing, and not all the political folks are really in tune with what's happening there. And there's not a ton of communication with communications, to be honest. Understandably, because some things are happening quickly and we're all very busy, right? But I noticed that that's a big thing, that if we could find a way to bridge that gap a little more, we may be more synchronous in doing things. But I've noticed for sure that this council has been much more receptive to hearing feedback, hearing criticism, talking about transparency, because for reasons that I think would take a lot of time to explain, there was a huge push in the last election from independent candidates who didn't know each other, from groups like iElect or other kinds of groups, who came forward and said, this is about transparency. And a lot of us got elected on that, on transparency and accountability. In fact, it worked its way into the city's priorities for this term of council. So I think because we have that, because even those who perhaps may not be inclined to that immediately are saying, you know what, we did say that. It is why these folks got elected. It was in their platforms. It is their mandate. And we can't stop them from doing that. And so that really speaks to the importance of people having platforms, the importance of people communicating their values and ideas, and the importance of them putting those at front and center in elections, because they can shape, right, what we end up actually doing when it comes to it. And if you give me one more second, I want to just say something about the other piece here that I think we don't talk about. A lot of this is about being right, being wrong, and embarrassment. As someone who's been a queer person all my life, it's being embarrassed is hard now at this point. After 45 years of being who I am, it's hard to get embarrassed. I sure do sometimes, but not so much. I think it's because of the way the world is, and I think because of the kinds of surveillance of queer people. And there's so many reasons for that, right? That you develop a different kind of understanding of rightness, wrongness, and embarrassment. But I don't think everyone's been exposed to that. And people don't want to talk about the transparent stuff or talk about things or expose issues because they're worried they're going to be embarrassed and be made to seem to be right or be wrong. And they don't want to apologize. And in a society like we have, apology is hard for people. You've seen it, right? Well, I've seen Jean Chrétien, Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau apologizing to, all kinds of folks for years, and how hard that seems to be for them and how much it matters to people because it's so limited. If we could just be more comfortable by saying, you know what, I screwed up, or I did this wrong. And I say it like all the time. Whoops, sorry, I got that information wrong, or I screwed something up. And I think because we don't have a culture of that in politics, because it makes people look weak, then we worry about talking about transparency and accountability as much as we should.
On that note, just to kind of bring it back to the matter with the police board, say, I want to know what your concerns are. Say that the police board's investigation goes forward and that they find that they were justified in these complaints against you. What are your concerns going forward if that's the case? And what are you worried about the precedent that might set for not just Hamilton, but let's be honest, other municipalities around Ontario?
Yeah, if the Ontario Civilian Police Commission decides that they would like to remove me from the board if they find the complaints valid, and that's the way this ends up, there'll be a hearing, and that's how that all works, right? You have to have a hearing in order to do it. So I won't really get into all that because that'll be a whole other thing if it occurs. It's a public hearing usually, as far as I know. But if that happens, then they remove me from the board as a result of this. It's going to send a huge chill. I think it's going to send a really troubling message also that the basic level of public critical commentary from an elected official is just not allowed. I'm making truthful, fact-based, frankly boring. If you watch the meetings and watch the video, I'm not screaming and yelling, and I'm just calmly talking about the issues, asking questions, and getting to these things in a reasonable manner, following all the processes that exist, right? Doing terms of references to make sure they're better, putting them in the bylaws, then going to the meetings religiously and participating in these meetings like an active participant. If that activity of me doing that, but also being a dissenting voice is not permitted, I think what we're going to have is a question publicly to ask about, so what is the role of the Hamilton Police Services Board? What is the role of police service boards? I think that has to be a big discussion that we have to have at that point. Because if I'm being told, look, if you'd like to be involved in these situations, get elected, get on the police board, sit on the budget committee, bring motions forward to the board. Talk about this in public if you wish to, as long as your comments on the board are the same as they are at city council, which is what the lawyer told me I had to do. I followed every rule. I've done everything I was told to do. If in doing all that, I'm still not permitted to participate in this democratic institution, then we have to ask some other questions and start interrogating what the role is. And if truly the role is not what we're being told it is, then I think that it should be entirely redone and rethought up to be honestly what it is, right? If this is here just simply for another purpose, then let's set it up for that purpose and not pretend that it's here to do the things it said it's here to do. Because everything I've done is within the law, has been in public, has been transparent and honest, and it surprised nobody also. No one should be surprised by a single word I've ever uttered in public on the subject. And I was elected on that mandate. So I think that troubles me and should trouble everybody.
You know what? I think we're coming up on our time for this episode. We'll be keeping an eye on it and see how this proceeds against you, Cameron. But thank you very much for taking the time from your busy schedule to come on and talk with us about this very important topic. And all the best in the days and weeks to come.
Thanks so much, Joel and Roland. Have a great day.
Thanks.